Hey everyone, and welcome back to Build UX. In this episode, we're going to finally begin the styling stage of our project to build out the nutrition UI design. And the first step to building this out, the CSS, is to actually get a CSS file added and linked up to our HTML file. So in our project folder, let's add a new file, and let's just call it app.css or styles.css, whatever makes sense to you. In our HTML document, let's add a link element with a rel of style sheet, and then the href can just point directly to app.css. Give that a save. One thing I need to make sure my live server extension is running here, so let's just hit go live to get that live preview going. And then to confirm that this is working, let's put in a temporary style. Let's say background color is going to be red, and we should immediately see that horrible change. Let's undo that. And we're back to normal, but we know that our styles are linked up correctly. So the first thing I like to add to any project that I work on is a very, very light amount of reset styles. Now, reset styles are used to reduce the inconsistencies between browsers and also give you a predictable platform to work from. So in our app.css, let's just add a quick comment heading here, and we'll just say this is our reset section of our styles. And you'll notice that I'm only going to really include what's absolutely necessary for a project right now. A lot of people reach for a more wide sweeping reset, like Reset CSS by Eric Meyer or Normalize CSS, but a lot of those put reset styles on elements that we won't even have in our project, and sometimes are putting resets on elements that we're going to apply different styles to anyway. So things like resetting margins on headings. All of our headings will receive a type spec class that should apply custom margins anyway, so a lot of that is overkill. And as we build out each component, we'll be careful to inspect everything to make sure we're getting the desired size, dimension, layout, all of that good stuff. So in our app.css reset section, let's actually start off with the HTML element itself. Now, one thing that I like to do is set my box sizing to border box, just to give a consistent box model method for sizing and controlling layout of my elements. Next up, I like to set the root font size to 62.5%. Now this may seem a little weird, but let me just type out a comment here real quick. I like to work in rems, and typically one rem is equal to 16 pixels. But then that makes it hard because let's say we want to do what's equivalent of 24 pixels. Well, now it becomes a little less clear how many rems that is. We might get into fractional rems, like in this case, it would actually be 1.5 rem. But if it was something like 18 pixels, or let's pick out a random number, let's say 88 pixels, it's a lot harder off the top of your head without reaching for a calculator to figure out the rem equivalent. So what I like to do by setting the root font size of the HTML element to 62.5% is it actually makes one rem equal to 10 pixels. And so now, let's say we have 12 pixels that we're going for. That would be equivalent to 1.2 rem. Or like I said before, if we had 88 pixels, well, that's just 8.8 rem. So this scales really nicely and makes it a lot more convenient to use rems. And it's important to use responsive units when sizing your UI, because if the user has changed their root font size in their browser settings for accessibility reasons, for legibility, everything in the UI should scale appropriately instead of using hard-coded pixels, which have been shown to be problematic when users change their browser settings for, instead of being 16 pixels as the base font size, maybe larger or smaller depending on their needs. So we have our font size of 62.5% in our HTML document. Next up, what we're going to do is target basically every element to set the box sizing that we declared for HTML. So we're going to target asterisk, which selects all elements in the HTML document. Next up, we'll do the before and after pseudo elements on every element. And then we'll basically tell it to be box sizing inherit. And that way everything in the DOM should receive a box sizing model of border box, and just makes everything predictable for layout and also sizing of our elements. Next up, let's get some additional base styles in. So our HTML and body should have a height of 100%. And this helps if you don't have much content on a page and you have a footer, let's say, and you want that footer to be at the bottom of the viewport. then you would need the HTML body to always be at least height of 100% in order to have that footer fixed to the bottom. But it's just a nice convenient reset, so I always include it in all of my projects. Next up, let's target the body element. And here is where we would set our font family and font size. We haven't implemented our fonts just yet, so let's put in a temporary sans serif as our font family. And here let's set a base font size of 1.6 rem. So you can see that our resetting of the font size on the HTML document now comes into play. A font size of 1.6 rem is the same thing as font size of 16 pixels. So sometimes it's nice to leave equivalent values in inline comments like this for other developers to see, but in the case of our rems, I think it's pretty understandable what's going on, so we can skip that for now. Last thing we need to do is make sure that the background color is explicitly set, even if by default in our app we want it to be white. It's always a good idea to make sure that that's in place. Now again, in a second here, we're gonna replace all of our colors with variables as kind of a design system implementation, but we'll just carve this out so we can get our reset styles established as needed. And actually, that's all we need for reset styles. So once we gave that a save here, you can see that we have our sans serif is the base font for everything in our app, and everything should have that font size starting out at 16 pixels, let's say for paragraph elements. And the box sizing of every element should be set to border box now. From here, we should have a nice predictable foundation to build off from without including a bunch of CSS that we really don't need in the long run. Next up, let's take a look at our design files here. And over here on the left of the document, we have some more kind of design system elements, some design atoms, if you will, that we can implement using variables to get nice consistent spacing values as well as colors established in our app. And so to start getting our variables established, we'll target the root element, so that way these variables are accessible on a global level to any class name. And let's add a little section comment here called color book and start carving out the colors that we see on the right here. So the first thing we have is charcoal 011. And this 3-digit code is really a reference to the lightness percentage of each color. That way, if in the future we need to come in and say, add a slightly less dark color than charcoal 21, we have space between 21 and 73 to give us tons of options in our color scale without having to rename everything in our file to make room. So some design systems and design documentation will have things like charcoal darkest, charcoal darker, charcoal lighter. But then if you need a new variation for that to accommodate accessibility needs or the statefulness of a component, you're kind of stuck in a situation where you have to rename everything to make room. So by just having the lightness value directly in the color name, it gives you, well, 100 options basically, although you won't need nearly that many, to be able to fit in new variations of the color in your color scale without having to go back and change everything in your files. So charcoal 11 is 161, C24 as the hex value. Next up, let's go through and complete the rest of our charcoal colors here. 2833, 42 is our charcoal 21. Okay, next up, we're gonna skip charcoal 73 because that was inaccessible, and we'll do the same with alarm 62 here. You can see the red contrast ratios mean that we won't be using it in our app. So we'll go right on to charcoal 46. It's our lightest charcoal value, and that'll be 73767A. Great. Next up, we have our color white, just pound FFF, nothing special there. We can move on to alarm 49 is where we'll start here. And this is EC110D. Next up is alarm 39, a little bit darker, used for a hover state on our related articles card. And this will be BD0E0A. And the last color that we added before the last episode is color slate blue. Slate blue 050. And this will be 4878B8. Okay, so one thing actually before we move on is let's actually go through and add a hyphen before each of these zeros here, just to separate out the color value, the lightness value from the color name. That's looking nice and good. So there we have our whole color book established. The next thing we can do is get our spacing variables established. So because we have this 4-pixel grid that doubles every time, we can implement these as variables, and then that way in our code, you can clearly see that we have consistent spacing throughout our app with each of the elements, whether it's margins, paddings, even heights of elements. It's just nice to variabilize these and gives a little more adherence to the design system we've established. So let's add another section comment here. Let's just say spacing. And one thing with spacing that I like to do, because it is a fixed set, is talk about the proportions of each spacing value to a default size. So by default, I usually say that space default is the 16 pixel equivalent. In our case, it's 1.6 rems. And then from here, I talk about if it doubles it or halves it further. So to give you an idea, let's start out with the smaller values. So we have space default. Let's go down to space half. In this case, that's 0.08 rems. Next up, we have space quarter, and this is 0.4 rems. And lastly, we have space eighth, talking about the proportion of each of these values to that default size of 1.6 rems. Now on the other side of things, we can talk about how things scale up. So we have space double is 3.2 rems. Space quadruple, we just shorten it to quad here, 6.4 rems. And space oct is going to be 12.8 rems, or 128 pixel equivalent. So that should take care of our spacing variables here. Now we have those available to any of our components as needed, and should be easy to implement the consistent spacing values we saw in our designs. The last thing we can tackle in this episode is getting our type specs implemented, as well as our actual custom fonts themselves. So let's give our preview a quick check. Nothing should have changed with adding these variables just yet, but we'll want to preview this for implementing our custom fonts. Now our custom fonts will actually need to be declared above our reset because we're going to be using them in our body global style here. So it's good to make sure you have everything in an intuitive order based on what needs to reference something higher in the document. So the first thing we're going to do is say @fontface. An @fontface declaration is used to define custom fonts by pointing to files that you have within your project, or pointing at a URL if you're importing those. So in the case of our typography, we have two typefaces. The first is the sans serif typeface called Muli, and then the display typeface called Usiva 1. So let's start off with Muli because that has the most unique weights to it. So font face Muli, the font style in this case is normal because we're not handling italicized text with this. The font weight, let's start out with, if we reference our files here, we'll have regular, bold, and black. Let's start out with regular, which I know is equivalent to a weight of 400 for this Google font. Last up, let's point it to the source URL. And we're going to start off by going through each of these file types that we provided. So typically you would start off with the URL that you want to be loaded if it's supported by the browser, and then you provide fallbacks. So WAF2 is a really modern file type for typefaces. So we'll start with WAF2, and then we'll provide WAF and then TTF as fallbacks in that order. So let's open up our URL quotes here. We'll go into our assets folder, the fonts folder, Muli, and then we'll start off with Muli regular WAF2. We'll add a comma here because we're going to be adding multiple URLs to this source. Again, going into the path as needed, grabbing our WAF file type, and lastly, doing the same for our TTF or true typeface file type. Okay, cool. That looks good. That should do it for the regular weight of Muli. Next, let's move on to the bold weight. We can actually copy a lot of this over. So instead of manually copying it, let's actually select this text and then holding Shift and Alt, You can hit the up or down keys to duplicate a block of text in VS Code. So that saves us a good bit of time. And let's do that one more time because we know we're going to actually need to implement 2 more specific typefaces. So let's just get those drafted out. Next up, we have our bold weight of Muli, which is 700 font weight. And then we can simply select regular as a string, and using Control D, select similar strings just for these 3. Let's say those are going to be bold. Coming down, we're going to do the black font weight, which is 900. And then again, selecting regular, let's replace that with black. Now that takes care of our sans serif typeface. So let's move on to our display typeface, which is Yasiva 1. And if we reference our starter files here, we'll see that there's only one weight, which is regular. So we can leave this at 400. And then what we want to do is make sure each of these file paths are correct. So we can replace that with Yasiva 1 and then select the desired file type from there. So by default, that'll put it as WAF2 for each of these, but we can just go in and make that WAF, make the last one here TTF. And actually looks like we need to do some cleanup. There we go, that's looking correct. Our indentation is a little weird here. That's just because we're forcing the text wrap. So what we can do actually is just collapse down that sidebar and that cleans everything up. Cool, so now the last step is to just get this typeface of Muli set up as our default font family. So in our body global style here, we can say that Muli will be used if it's available, and if not, we'll fall back to a sans serif. Let's give that a save and check in on our live preview. And it looks like our custom typeface is in place. We actually have different weights being used by default because headers have default styles of a heavier font weight. Links and body copy, obviously you're using more of a regular font weight. And we'll be able to specify that as we implement the type specs per component. Now that we have our font faces established up top with our custom fonts, let's actually add a couple useful variables related to typography, so that way we don't have to manually set font family, font weights, things like that every time we want to use them. So let's just say that this is typography in terms of our variable section here. And the first thing we want to say is that the font family sans is going to point to Muli sans serif, and then our font family serif in this case is going to point to Yasiva 1 and fall back to a serif typeface if it's not available to the browser. Next up, we can do our font weights. So in this project, we have a weight regular, which is 400, a weight bold, which is 700, and a weight black, which is 900. Now, since our body global reset style uses the sans serif font stack, it'd be good to move our variables up above our reset styles so they're available for use below. So let's cut these, go above our reset section, paste them in. Everything's looking good. We could actually use a section comment above our typography up here. That's looking good. Give that a save. Nothing should really change. Let's use our font family sans variable here and replace that with the hard-coded font family down below. Get that formatted, paste it in. We give it a save. Nothing should change on the right. Everything's working as expected. And that's looking good. So we got our font faces in here, our custom web fonts, some variables established for more of our design atoms or a design system, if you will, and our reset styles. So the last thing we should tackle in this episode is getting our type spec classes all set and ready to use throughout our components. So our type specs, we can reference our design files, and you'll see the text styles here in Figma. And we can basically just build each of these out using some of the new typefaces and variables that we established above. So the first one we do is just T brand. I like to use the T hyphen prefix for any typography specs, Just makes it easy when you implement it to understand that's more of a utility class for applying type styles and not a component in itself. So T-brand, let's take a look at our text style in Figma. We know that the font family is going to be the font family sans. Next up, we have the font size is 2.4 rems. And the line height in this case is going to be just 1. Since it's only on a single line, it doesn't wrap to a new line, we're fine with just a line height of 1. Now, how I got the line height, I like to just use proportional line height, is just looking at the ratio of line height in pixels to the font size in pixels. So in this case, it's 24 and 24, so our line height proportion is just 1. Next up, let's go into our T copy large. Now looking at our design real quick just for reference. Let's zoom out a bit here. So T brand is for this nutrition logo up top. T copy large is kind of a generic type spec used in the global navigation, a lot of the menu items. It's used for this BlackBerry section heading, the labels on nutrition information, the share, call to action down here. So it's more of kind of a generic UI text style, which is why it's just called copy large. So T copy large, let's take a look at what we need. And one thing I forgot to do on T brand was actually set the font weight. So let's make sure we set that to the font weight of weight black. And then in T copy large, let's get our specific specs in place there. So this will mostly mimic what we had for T brand. Font family sans. The font size will be 1.6 rem. The line height is 1.6 rem. And the weight in this case will be weight bold. Looking good. Let's move on to display desktop. We'll actually implement both the desktop and mobile versions of type specs in one class using media queries, but they're defined separately in Figma just because you can't have responsive type specs here. So looking at display desktop, this would be used for our article heading. Let's take a look at what it's supposed to be above a mobile breakpoint. So let's start off by actually writing a media query since everything will be encapsulated in these. And let's just say a min width of 576 pixels. 575 pixels is a good generic kind of guess at what a mobile breakpoint might look like. What we'll do is after we establish some of our media queries, we'll actually want to resize our browser through all breakpoints and just make sure that it works at every viewport size. Okay, so for display, for our desktop size, we are going to have a font family. Let's actually target T display. It'll all be one class. And we're going to have a font family of serif. Next up, we know our font size is 8 rems. Our font weight is regular, so because we only have one font weight declared above in our typography, we don't need to specify it here. It'll just be the default. We have a line height of 96 pixels, so it would be good to actually calculate this out. We got our calculator pulled up here. All we have to do is say 96 divided by 80. And that gives us a 1.2 proportion for our line height. So line height here is 1.2. And the last thing we see is that we have a letter spacing of -2 pixels in this case. And this is equivalent to tracking in design tools. So our letter spacing is -0.2 rems. And that should take care of the desktop styling for T display. Next up, let's move to the mobile styles to see how this changes responsively. So I like to think of mobile first and put my media queries for mobile above my desktop queries. As I mentioned, we'll have mobile go from 0 to 575 pixels, and then anything above that for now, we'll just treat as a desktop style. So most of this will be the same as what we found in our desktop media query. So we can actually copy out those CSS values, create kind of a parent block class here for T display of all sizes, paste those in. We know basically the letter spacing will stay the same and the font family will stay the same. So we can remove those from our media query here. And that way we're just changing font size and line height within each media query. We can copy this over to our mobile media query and change this up to be 3.2 rems and a line height of 40 pixels. Let's grab our calculator once more. So that'd be a 1.25 line height, a slight change there. One thing I like to do with my CSS files is visually group anything that's tied to a specific class or a block once we get into components. So we'll just tuck up these media queries to be right after our T-display class. All right, moving along here, we have our body, which is used throughout for our generic body copy. So we have T-body. Take a look at what we have for those properties. This is going to be similar to our copy large with some slight variations, so we'll just copy those properties down. Font family sans. Looks like our font size is 1.4 rem. We have no letter spacing. Font weight is going to be regular. And then our line height, once more, grab our calculator. And we'll do 18 divided by 14. I like to do 3 decimal places, so we'll do 1.286. For our line height, that's looking good. Should take care of body for now. Title is another responsive typeface. Let's actually copy our T-display out, just so we have the general structure of a block or a base class plus some media queries, and update the class names appropriately. So this would be T-title. Let's take a look at what we have for desktop. So this will be a font family of sans. There's no letter spacing in this case, so we can get rid of that, but we will share the font weight of weight black. And then we can go into each media query and get the right font size and line height. So for our desktop size, which we have pulled up here, we have 2.8 rems is the font size, and then 32 pixels is our line height. Calculate that out real quick. So we have 1.143. Got that implemented. Let's take a look at our mobile style for this type spec. 24 pixels is the font size, and then 2.8 is our line height. Once more, make sure we have that. 1.167 is what we'll do. That takes care of T title for us. Moving right along, section number. This is used for the section selector. It's this big numeral here. Let's grab that. This is going to use our display typeface. So T section number. Font family is going to use font family serif. Next up, we have a really large font size of 12 rem, equivalent to 120 pixels. We have the same thing for line height because it won't wrap to a new line. So we'll put that in as 1 actually, just a proportional line height. And then like before, this display typeface has a letter spacing that we chose of -0.2 rem. So the last thing we need here is copy fluid. Now I wasn't sure what to name this, but basically it's used for some of the mobile designs, particularly with the nutrition facts, where it shares all of the same properties as copy large, except for on mobile, it actually needs to reduce in size, whereas copy large used elsewhere in the UI, such as these global navigation links or this title here, will actually remain the same, regardless of viewport size. So let's create this responsive type spec just for these limited use cases, and we can get that implemented as needed. So in our code editor, let's just grab the T copy large styles. We'll make these the desktop breakpoint for copy fluid. Paste that in. This will be T copy fluid. Let's go ahead and copy out our media queries from above and adapt them to be used for this class name. And we know for a fact that font family sans is shared across the board, and the same with line height and the font weight. So really the only thing changing is going to be our font size in each case. And let's take a look at what we need. So for desktop, it'll remain a font size of 2.8 rems. And then for mobile, if we look at copy fluid over here, it'll just go down to 1.4 rems. And since we copied this font size from another type spec, let's see what we used for copy large. So that'd be 1.6 rems. So we just barely make it smaller on mobile to accommodate less available layout space. And to establish a better content hierarchy, if I actually show you the mobile redesigns here, between the nutrition information and some of the title elements or global navigation elements when we get into our menu. So that should do it for implementing our type specs. At this stage, we have basically all of the building blocks we need to rapidly build out this UI component by component, get everything styled and looking great, and really hone in on our responsive styles. So let's give this document a save. Let's make sure everything looks as we'd expect in our live preview here. So that should do it for this episode. In the next episode, we'll start styling out this UI component by component. We'll begin working our way through the global header and see how far we can get and make progress from there.